I'm absolutely delighted to introduce Jonathan Shanklin. I'm sure many of you will know, but for those of you who don't, he is a meteorologist and emeritus fellow at the British Antarctic Survey, famous for discovering what is now known as the Antarctic ozone hole. He is also chair of the BSBI Committee for England and Vice County Recorder for Cambridgeshire. And Jonathan will be speaking to us this afternoon about checklists, floras, rare plant registers, and site registers. So over to you, Jonathan.
Thank you, Sarah. Hopefully that's showing correctly, is it?
That looks great.
Great. So I'm going to take you on a whirlwind tour of some of these subjects. Hopefully an interesting one, and in the latter part, perhaps slightly provocative. So starting on the easy end, that's the checklists. You can generate these quite easily using the MapMate database that many recorders run. And that will just give you a very simple list. You can use the DDB to generate a similarly simple list with a very simple query. And this just tells you the number of records of various species that are present in your county. Now, making it a little bit more complex query and asking to divide by the date range and including the vernacular name and counting the number of monads, you get a somewhat different list. And it's very good to be able to report that all the entries are now updated to their STACE 4 names, which perhaps makes a big difference later on, because I know many recorders have already converted some of their documentation to STACE 4. Again, you can create a similar sort of list using MapMate. And this is for my own county, and it just gives the first date in the database, which isn't necessarily the same as the first date of recurrence. And you sometimes need to do a bit of historical research to work out when the first true record actually took place. But then you can start to augment that in a very simple way. So this is an example where there's a checklist with some notes. And so it tells you a little tiny bit about each of the individual plants. And that is used by quite a few counties, and they've produced checklists that are available online. So that's just a couple of examples here. But the checklist doesn't necessarily need to cover just a vice county. It can cover a subunit, or as we heard earlier this morning, a region, or it can even cover a site. And the site list, or even the regional list, doesn't necessarily have to restrict itself to vascular plants. You can broaden it to your heart's content. Moving on to floras, these we've heard a little bit about floras already this morning, and on the BSBI webpage there is a list of the available county floras along with rare plant registers that I'll come up to shortly. These are available in a variety of different forms. We'll just have a look at a few of them, starting with Cambridgeshire, because Cambridgeshire perhaps has the longest history of county floras, beginning in the 17th century. And then since then, there have been various new floras, as Owen mentioned in his talk. So 18th century, 19th century, 20th century, and leading into the 21st century, when we had one of the first digital floras that is available online. And this gives very detailed accounts of the location and the actual records for many of the species, and also divides up the flora into rare species, which might on occasion include rare alien species, more general aliens, and then the common to uncommon species. And most recently, of course, there's Alan Leslie's 2019 Flora of Cambridgeshire. Moving around the BSBI area, there are a variety of different formats. So Paul Green has produced a digital flora for County Waterford, which is freely available online. Most floras, however, are published in book form, and these are quite variable. And I think it's probably true to say that there's many different styles as there are Vice-County recorders. So on the left there, you can see the recent Flora of Cornwall, which has species accounts, photographs and distribution maps. And on the right, the Cambridgeshire equivalent, which has very detailed accounts of the species and their variability, but only a list of hectads in which they occur. And if that had included images and distribution maps, it would probably have weighed in at some 5 kilos. As Owen showed this morning, a flora doesn't necessarily have to cover a county. And also Ian Truman showed with the flora of the Black Country, it can be a region. Owen's covered more of a habitat, but a habitat defined by geography. There are, of course, fenland areas outside his 5-metre contour level, which are equally important as a habitat. On a wider scale, we have the red lists. And for example, these will be drawn up using very strict guidelines set by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, so that, at least in theory, every country has a red list that is drawn up in exactly the same way. And as Jim mentioned, there is one for Ireland, England and Wales, but not yet one available for Scotland. And that is clearly a gap that needs to be filled. Those red lists lead us in to the rare plant registers. And again, there's a spreadsheet detailing the rare plant registers on the BSBI webpage. Historically, of course, there was very much a focus on rarity rather than any other indicator of conservation value. And I'm going to start being a little bit more controversial in the next few slides. So the first question is really, what is the rare plant register for? Who is it for? What is it for? Is it for the author, for local botanists, consultants, the BSBI generally, local authorities, national agencies such as Natural England and National Resources Wales, and so on? And it's really quite important to think about the who when you're drawing up a rare plant register. There's also the what of the process. What is that register for? Is it to document where the rare plants are and provide beautiful illustrations of them? Is it to help the planning process so that planners can avoid building or advocating building on the places that host them? Or is it, and I think this is probably more increasingly the case, to promote conservation, to show what species are of really critical importance because they are declining? And there is a commitment to reverse biodiversity decline by 2030, which is deemed to be possible but in part we need to know what we've got and what is actually declining. Now, in part, the National Plant Monitoring Scheme that Jim mentioned looks to achieve that. And some of the early results from this suggest that perhaps some habitats are actually improving. The topic of Lizzie's talk on arable margins, that doesn't look to be doing so well. But is this perhaps just indicating that the recorders are getting more adept at the recording? That's perhaps over controversial, and I'll probably regret saying it, but it is something that we need to be clear about. Under the NERC Act, which really applies mostly to England, there is a list of plants which need priority action fairly immediately. And this was set up in 2013, and there's quite a long list of these species, some of which are now very, very rare. Some are still around. So, for example, the Astragalus danicus that I've illustrated, quite amazingly, that came up out of the seed bank at Magog Down following the creation of a scrape. However, when you drill in and find out what actions are being taken, for rather too many of them, the action is yet to start. And that is really quite a worrying condemnation, that if we're going to reverse the biodiversity decline, we shouldn't be starting 10 years after the project was started. The RSPB and BTO have a parallel process to the IUCN one, where they look at the birds of conservation concern. These are ones that are largely suffering decline as breeding species. And I'm going to advocate that we need to do something similar for our flora. And when I first drew up a rare plant register for Cambridgeshire, I'd used the pre-2017 notes on what was supposed to go into it, which largely focused on the rarest species. However, this was revised in 2017 and is definitely worth looking at. And the particular details are not so much those with red list statuses, but the optional things at the bottom, which are the locally declining species, which are really the ones that are going to be most important for reversing biodiversity decline. The rarest species are probably going to be in protected habitats anyway. It's the plants that are in the less protected areas that we need to be worrying about. And so I think when you include some of those optional characteristics, you then get what is effectively a register of plants of conservation concern. And some of these things are quite surprising, even in the sort of the international class at the top of this list, those for which we have international responsibility. And that can include quite apparently common species, such as Hyacinthoides non-scripta, the common bluebell of England, at least. You need to be careful that you don't confuse it with Campanula rotundifolia, which is the Scottish bluebell. So we need to be precise in our language. But it is an interesting point that once you start looking in detail at all of these categories, there are some quite surprising plants that should be in your register of plants of conservation concern. So what should it go in? As I said, definitely all those species that are in significant local decline, those that have a country threat in the red list of near threatened or greater, and also those that are locally or nationally scarce or rare. That will usually restrict you to the native or archaeophyte species, but doesn't preclude aliens or neophytes where they're long established or have a specific local interest. And one that I originally included in my own list was, and still is there, is purple toothwort, which I think there's a picture coming up in a minute. By and large, they may exclude difficult species such as rubus and taraxacum, except if you have a specialist in those taxa in your county. You might want an appendix for species that are no longer present in the county or area. You could have an appendix for hybrids. And it's also worth having an appendix of species that are of conservation concern for a different reason. And that is because they may be or potentially are invasive. There are some considerations to take into account. The cutoff date to use, certainly with all the intensive effort that has gone into recording for Atlas 2020, we can split it at the 20-year boundary. But if your recording has been really good and uniform over that 20-year period, then it may be possible to even use a 10-year period for determining decline. Another issue is, when does a plant stop declining? And that can be quite tricky to determine, particularly when a plant is on the sort of boundary, so that it might be in a list in 1 year and out again the next. That does imply that you're doing updates on an annual basis, but as I'll come to mention, that doesn't actually take too much time. And then there's the scale on which the decline takes place. It might be on a hectad, tetrad or monad level. And so you need to look at those three criteria separately. And certainly for my own county, I was very surprised that some plants had actually declined at a monad level, despite the much finer level of recording post 2000. And I suggest that a simple list is probably going to be the most useful resource for planning departments and the like, because they really just need to know what to tell consultants to look for when a planning application is in front of them. So in order to make a provisional scan through, it's fairly simple to put in a query to the database, and that will give you an overall list of your native and archaeophyte species and the number of monads in which they occur. Now, for some of these, very clearly the post-2000 recording is much greater, because it's unlikely that Acer campestre has really changed significantly. But others, for example, Achillea tarmica, there's really no change in the monad count between the two date classes, but overall, there's almost certainly decline. So that is one plant, for example, that I would put into the register of concern. So what do these registers look like? Some are beautifully illustrated, detailed documents that describe the locations of all the plants and the threats that they face. Many are available online, and I've just used a selection of those that are available to illustrate one particular species, which is locally extinct or regionally extinct in Cambridgeshire, but is present in neighbouring counties, and that's Agremonia procera. And so I'm just sort of highlighting that as an example in some of these online publications. So it tells you where it's found, often with a precise grid reference, and when it was last seen and who saw it. Here's an Irish example for the same species. Again, where, the grid reference, the date of last occurrence, and who made the record. And who made the record can actually be quite important, because some recorders are perhaps more reliable than others. Every county in Wales has its own rare plant register. This is the Flintshire example, again for Agremonia procera. And in addition to the standard fields, there's also a note about abundance and habitat, which can be quite important for conservation purposes. So looking at my own register, I've done something rather different. This is the one that I produced originally prior to the 2017 revision. So it just gives the Latin and vernacular names, the local status, how many monads the species is in, date of first and last occurrence, and a few other general notes. In parallel with that, I produced a register of plants of conservation concern, which was much more wide-ranging and included some of the plants that seem to be in significant decline in the county, such as Veronica beccabunga, brooklime, and Cirsium palustri, marsh thistle. These may be surprising additions to a register of plants of conservation concern, particularly if you're in a more westerly location, but certainly here in the east of England, they are not as common as they used to be. For the brooklime, it's probably the degradation of many of the old ponds that were present for providing drinking water for horses, and they have virtually all gone. So having discovered that my register of plants of conservation concern could double as a rare plant register, I've amalgamated the two into just one document for the future. And that gives a little bit more detail. I probably can enhance it a bit further, and possibly following the RSPB type of register of birds of conservation concern, putting in a color coding as to which category things are in might be useful. And I've got a register of extinct species. So this is where my example of the Agremonia procera comes in, because it was last reported, at least in the county, in 1932. Although we do have the common agrimony in a much larger variety, which shares some of the vegetative characteristics of the fragrant agrimony. And there's an appendix for the invasive species, which I've given as 3 threat levels. One where it's being actively removed because it is affecting other species. 2, where it's clearly increasing in abundance quite rapidly. And 3, where it's perhaps just something to keep an eye on in case it becomes a problem. And for comparison, I've included 1 or 2 plants that are listed as noxious weeds, for example, the creeping thistle. Once you've got your list, you can do quite a few things with it. So here they've, for the Waterford example, they've shown how many in each of different categories there are. And for Cambridgeshire, I've produced a heat map showing where the greatest concentration of the plants of conservation concern exist. And as Owen mentioned, the various washes, so this is the Nain wash at the top, the ooze washes, the sands around Gamlingay, Wicken Fen, and the Breckland habitat to the east. Also, there's a concentration around Cambridge that is only partly local recorder effort, and that is something to be aware of. But also in the southeast of Cambridge, there are the chalk grasslands, which do contain many rare and threatened species. And then just to finish with, I'm going to briefly mention the concept of site registers. As we've seen, it's not just the rare plants themselves, it's where they grow. So the ooze washes, for example, are an important plant area as devised by Plant Life. And so incorporating where rare species grow into a register of sites becomes increasingly important. So for Cambridgeshire, I've probably gone completely over the top and have tried to produce a register of all our designated sites, which may be triple SIs, county wildlife sites, city wildlife sites, local nature reserves, etc., together with some worthwhile but as yet undesignated sites. And one problem that I've found with this is the boundaries and names of triple SIs, county wildlife sites, national nature reserves and the like are all different. And it can be quite confusing as to exactly what you should put in your register. And I think, much to Jim's surprise, I've managed to exactly use up the time. He thought I couldn't possibly show 50 odd slides in 25 minutes. But just to finish with, here's one of the rarest species in Cambridgeshire, along with some of the invasive species. One of our particular banes at the moment is Lepidium draba hoary cress, which is just coming into leaf and will soon be flowering, and that's spreading on many road verges. And then Conia maculatum hemlock and even the common nettle are doing very well thanks to eutrophication of verges and the like. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. I found that super interesting because I'm trying to do something similar at my estate where I work, Carrara, a very local basis, of course, but compiling rare plant register and conservation interest registers. So it's really, really helpful and good to know that we were on the right line.